Hello and welcome back to the Land and Climate podcast. This week I've been talking to Margot Gibbs from respected investigative outfit Lighthouse Reports about her work in uncovering a US government-supported public relations operation aimed at undermining pesticide critics, environmental scientists, campaigners and some major organisations including UN bodies, and labelling them as anti-science and anti-science protest industry.
What J-Burn v-Fluence's boss specialises in is messing with people's belief formation. So you read some news headline about a new finding about a pesticide being harmful. If you can ensure that when someone goes to Google that, they at the same time see something that casts doubt on the credibility of that scientist or people who work on that issue, then you get in the way of belief formation. And if you get in the way of belief formation, then you get in the way of anyone asking their governments to do anything differently.
I started by asking Margot to give an introduction to the subject and how she had begun investigating it.
So the investigation's around this PR firm called v-Fluence. It's a small Missouri PR firm. It's run by a former boss of Monsanto. They're relatively small and not that well known. How we came to it was I was talking to people about why we didn't see more funding and more popular support from governments for agroecological farming. You know, this is a hugely promising new techniques, drawing on a lot of old methods which help farming be done in a resilient way and using much lower levels of agrochemicals, which are damaging for the biosphere. They were putting on a regional conference to highlight this issue. They got a lot of pushback, and they had been told that this pushback had come from the US government. So I wasn't very familiar with this area at all. To me, it was quite a surprise. Why would the US government be getting in the way of scientists trying to put on a conference in East Africa about pesticides? We sent a bunch of freedom of information requests to various government departments. One of them is the US Department of Agriculture's Foreign Agricultural Service, not an agency I was familiar with. But we sent a FOIA there because the FAS, the Foreign Agricultural Service, it has offices in like every country that the US has a consular service. And they're very active in East Africa. And what came back from that FOIA was what looked like coordinated communication between the US government and people from several different agencies, agrochemical companies, and this little company called v-Fluence, and a guy there called J-Burn. And they had been coordinating together in what looked like an attempt to undermine the conference, including notes highlighting who the funders of this conference were and raising the issue of whether or not those funders would be best pleased that this conference was going on. And this was coordinated at the same time as the African Development Bank, in fact, pulled their support from the conference. So the African Development Bank and the Swiss Development Agency were both set to fund it. The African Development Bank, at the same time as this coordination was going on, pulled their funding for it, which meant the Swiss had to as well, because they only fund things that in this context that the African development funding. So that was how we got onto it. It was talking to people about what was getting in the way of agroecological solutions to how we grow our food, and what appeared to be a coordination between industry and the US government via this small PR firm called v-Fluence.
Okay, so just to recap on that, and you've got a PR company, a very small PR company called v-Fluence that is compiling a database about people who are kind of enemies to their cause, essentially, and enemies to the cause of what looks like the US government interests, but also agrochemical interests as well, agro-industry interests.
Yeah, so from that initial like, okay, it looks like these guys are working together to take down people who are raising concerns about pesticides and proposing solutions to the problems they cause. We then went off and were like, okay, that's fine, see what we can find. And what we found was that the US government had been funding this firm to compile dossiers on what they call in the contractual terms, critics of modern agriculture techniques. After months of investigation, we managed to get our eyes on a number of these profiles. And what they were actually doing was compiling dossiers of extremely personal information, including home addresses, romantic relationships, whether someone has had a driving offence, on scientists who are doing research on the ways in which pesticides can cause neurodegenerative problems, cancer, Alzheimer's. So the US government was paying this firm to create these dossiers on critics of pesticides, also GMOs, and not just scientists, but activists, academics, NGOs. They're doing this on over 500 individuals we found, and all around the world.
Just on compiling information on people, scientists, etc., can you kind of explain what you think is wrong with that? Because some people could say, well, look, PR companies, if you're running a campaign, what you do is you compile information on people who are maybe working against your own interests or the interests of your clients, and you profile what they're up to.
I guess we can answer that in a number of ways. Like, one is that in Europe, at least, we have the GDPR, which actually prohibits that kind of profiling. On a practical level, you could say there was a public interest in compiling information that had something to do with their actual work. So it's worthwhile to keep a database about the actual work and the substance of that work. But compiling information about someone's personal life, which has got nothing to do with their professional work, raises serious questions. And I guess the background to why this is particularly important is that there's a history of harassment and doxing, essentially, for people who are critical of agrochemical companies and their products. The journalists who we work with on this are a good example. Carrie Gillam, the Guardian US reporter, also editor of The New Lead, is a brilliant journalist who used to work at Reuters and has written some of the best journalism about the links between glyphosate and cancer. And this firm claims to have got her fired from Reuters, falsely claims to have got her fired. But they would write to her editors every time she wrote an article that brought up criticism or brought up concerns about the links between glyphosate, Monsanto's leading herbicide, and cancer. They didn't get her fired, but Carrie still had to defend each one of those articles in a way that essentially would put a lot of people off from doing public interest work. So that's the context that this is happening in, that this kind of personal information is being gathered in. It's if you raise your head above the parapet, what is going to happen?
Can you just lay out some more of the examples of some of the things that you found? So, for example, I read there was an article in Le Monde, for example, that talked about the attempt by the previous Trump administration and the US Department of Agriculture to use the same PR company to help torpedo the EU's farm to fork strategy, which involved lowering climate and environmental impacts of farming.
Yeah, absolutely. So we see this relationship between the US government and this PR firm go on over a number of years. They're in fairly regular communication. The first contract that we identified was actually a contract from the US Agency for International Development. And this was the one where this database was kind of created, where the contract seems to have actually mandated the creation of this secret network called Bonus Aventus. This is the secret website where the profiles of the scientists, activists, NGOs are kept. That appears to have been created as part of the USAID contract. And then the second contract we identified between the US government and this PR firm was part of, as you say, a contract created by the first Trump administration. It was created in the context of the European Green Deal, the cornerstone of which was farm to fork, the cornerstone of which was an intention to reduce pesticide use by 50%. That was a matter of concern for the US government. So the US government wants to challenge the way in which Europe does its regulation. And that's critically to do with how we regulate around pesticides. going back to what this contract actually said, it was for a firm who worked closely with v-Fluence called the White House Writers Group. And it was to write op-eds which were claiming that the farm to fork strategy or the policies around it would lead to famine, food insecurity, quite standard fare. It also included access to Bonus Aventus, which is the network that has the profiles of all of the scientists, academics, NGOs. So Bonus Aventus was a key part of that contract, which was signed, I should say, in the final months of the Trump administration. And we have been told by the USDA during the Biden administration, in response to our reporting, that contract was being reviewed. We don't know whether it might come into use again. It was a blanket purchase agreement, 5-year agreement. It could still be used now.
So what's happening here? Why is the US government funding such activity and what has it to gain?
The dynamics here are really interesting. It's because on the face of it, it's quite dumbfounding. You're like, why would the US have this interest in how other countries do their regulation? And it's because of trade, primarily because of trade, at least in my analysis. The regulations around pesticides really matter for the US because they export a lot of their food. If you have higher regulations for things like maximum residue levels, so how much pesticide is allowed to be on your food, then it makes it much harder for US farmers to export. So you see a lot of the communications from the agencies that are working with v-Fluence, the emphasis is on standard global regulations, which are done through something called Codex. And they want to fall back on those regulations because they're relatively weaker than what countries would institute if they were regulating on, say, the precautionary principle.
What I thought was also quite interesting is we've got in this story, there's Syngenta, which is a big agro-chemicals company, but now owned by the Chinese government. So how does that fit in?
When we were doing our first research around v-Fluence, we checked court records, and the court records showed this recent case filed by a female farmer called Donna Evetts. She was filing alongside her son and on behalf of her late husband, and their complaint was to v-Fluence and Syngenta. Her husband had died a few years ago from the effects of Parkinson's disease. They had used herbicide called paraquat for 3 decades on their farm. After her husband developed Parkinson's, she developed Parkinson's, as did her son. They were bringing a case against Syngenta because Syngenta is alleged to have known for more than 4 decades the risks that their best-selling herbicide, paraquat, had in terms of potentially causing Parkinson's disease. In Europe, paraquat is banned because of the risk that it causes Parkinson's disease. In the United States, it's still used. They were bringing, so Donna Evetts, suffering from Parkinson's disease, was bringing this case against Syngenta, the manufacturer of paraquat, but also against v-Fluence. And the allegation that she made is that v-Fluence had been working for Syngenta for 20 years to suppress information about the risks of developing Parkinson's disease because of using paraquat. So specifically, what that claim says is that v-Fluence had worked to undermine the credibility of organizations which raised concerns around Parkinson's and paraquat. So this is, for example, Pesticides Action Network, who were some of the earliest people to be raising these concerns, and that they would undermine the credibility so that people, if they saw that risk published something by Pesticide Action Network, would be less likely to believe it. Another related claim is that they worked to manipulate SEO, essentially manipulate Google results, so that when you searched for paraquat Parkinson's, you did not see credible information. You saw this website that was actually secretly hosted by Syngenta that told you that everything was okay, that everything was safe. So v-Fluence are alleged to have worked for 20 years for Syngenta to do work undermining those who raise concerns around pesticide use, and specifically their pesticides like paraquat. They were also employed to undermine regulation by the precautionary principle. You see this coming up again and again. The precautionary principle is a real threat. So yeah, the v-Fluence was doing this work for Syngenta, which is in fact very, very similar, closely overlapping to the work that they were doing for the US government. There is a strange dynamic in terms of why the US is doing this kind of work, which functions to support the largest pesticide companies, which are in fact not American. Syngenta is a Swiss chemical company that's owned by the Chinese government. Monsanto used to be an American company, now owned by Bayer, which is German. So there's this kind of question mark. You're like, why are they doing this? And my answer to that is because the US is still the engine of high pesticide industrial agriculture. That is the fundamental way in which American farming is done. And in order to keep their exports going, you need global regulation to be as low as possible.
What did the US government respond on your investigation? Was there a response? I mean, I think you alluded to the fact that there might have been something, you received word that some of this bonus aventus work was kind of dropped or may have been at least paused.
The US government response was, from a journalistic point of view, very disappointing. The US Agency for International Development, which is one of the agencies which has given the most money to v-Fluence for this work, has really refused to engage properly with what their work has done. The US Department of Agriculture said that they had paused their contract, that it was under review. Now, that was during the Biden administration. We're back in the Trump administration now, and the contract was created during the Trump administration. So we don't know. The political interests of this Trump administration are very different from the last.
And is this the kind of issue that kind of is fairly low profile anyway, in that there's a relatively low public knowledge interest and therefore not high level of political engagement in the issue?
Well, yeah, it's an interesting question. I guess in terms of one PR firm and one contract, it might be fairly small, but as a political issue in terms of how the US is going to go about doing things, it's fairly major. The Maha movement is a huge political force, and there is an opportunity for the US to actually make some reforms to their agricultural practices, but that's going to face massive backlash from the significant interests that these political parties have with the industrial agriculture complex.
On the EU side of things, I mean, a lot of these agro-chemical companies are EU based. Arguably, they represent, for example, Bayer could represent quite a significant German economic interest. Has there been any reaction?
Bayer claim that they have never paid v-Fluence. Bayer and Monsanto are leading members of CropLife, the trade group for the pesticides industry, and they did have contracts with v-Fluence. When we raised the concerns around the profiling of scientists to them, they said that they would look into the issues. We are, in fact, in communication with them again to see the results of those investigations.
Something I read in your research was that v-Fluence and its lead person was a senior executive at Monsanto.
v-Fluence is closely tied with Monsanto. v-Fluence is founded by Jay Byrne. Jay Byrne was a communications director at Monsanto, where he worked on the acceptance of GMO crops. Just so everyone knows, the importance and the connection between GMO crops and pesticides is that Monsanto's best-selling GMO crops were called Roundup Ready seeds. So these are seeds which are genetically engineered to withstand applications of glyphosate, of Roundup. So what that means in practice is that farmers farming huge areas of land can grow their crop and then do over-the-top herbicide spraying. So they can spray the whole field and that crop will not be killed by this all-purpose herbicide. It has led to huge environmental problems in the United States and other countries where these Roundup Ready seeds have been used. But so it really ties the GMO technology to the pesticide use. So that's why these points go hand in hand.
I just also wondered about effectiveness in terms of, you've looked into the work of v-Fluence and partners. How effective do you actually think that they were?
It's a really good question, and it's quite difficult to give it a clear answer. What I would say is that what Jay Byrne, v-Fluence's boss, specializes in is messing with people's belief formation. So you read some news headline about a new finding about a pesticide being harmful. If you can ensure that when someone goes to Google that, they at the same time see something that casts doubt on the credibility of that scientist or people who work on that issue, then you get in the way of belief formation. And if you get in the way of belief formation, then you get in the way of anyone asking their governments to do anything differently. So although it might be very hard to quantify, I actually think that this work is massively important and does have a massive impact. And I'm not just trying to drum up new business for Jay Byrne here. I think that you see this when you're researching an area. If you have something that casts a doubt in your head about any figure of authority, that means you then do the intellectual work. You go and establish whether or not that doubt is correct. But that is time and it's brain attention. And if you're talking about the general public, not a journalist, so someone who's not going to go and spend 4 hours establishing that this is not in fact a correct doubt, then you're messing with any ability to get the general public engaged in this subject. And that's massively important because governments aren't going to act if there isn't public support for something. So yes, I think that the work that v-Fluence does in casting doubt on the credibility of authoritative research into deadly chemicals, I think it's massively important.
Does the US government deny ever having had a contract with v-Fluence?
No.
So they accepted that?
Yeah. The v-Fluence were trying to play with words. Essentially, they had subcontracts from the US government.
Right.
They were engaged under subcontracts. So the money might have been paid out by a research institute, or it might have been paid out, or the contract might have been made via another public relations firm, but they were named on contracts which were publicly funded to do specified work, which we reported on. Syngenta denies that there is a link between Parkinson's disease and paraquat. It refused to comment on our wider allegations because it said these were things that it had to talk about in court, so it wouldn't talk about its contracts with v-Fluence.
The kind of environment which we have, pardon the pun, around pesticide use is quite a polarized one. What do you think is going on in that?
I think it's helpful for the pesticide companies if it's polarized. And I think, at least in the context of the investigation into v-Fluence, certainly polarizing debate is something that's helpful for them because it helps to say that this research is out on a limb. In fact, public health concerns have massive popular support. People don't want to be poisoned by their food, but there are attempts to make that a controversial issue. And we do well to look at the history of denial on this. You know, we do well to look at the fact that it wasn't actually the tobacco lobby that made merchants of doubt. It was the pesticides lobby. It was Rachel Carson.
Thanks very much to Margot Gibbs from Lighthouse Reports. For the record, the PR company v-Fluence deny having held government contracts now or in the past, and they say that the US government was a, quotes, funder of other organisations with whom we work, close quotes. The agro-chemicals company Syngenta deny the allegations made in the lawsuits, this is the paraquat lawsuits, but did not answer questions about v-Fluence and Bonus Aventis, saying it would like to address the claims made in court. And since we recorded the interview with Margot, Lighthouse and The Guardian have reported that v-Fluence have ceased their profiling operations. There are links to this news and the suggested further reading list from Margot on this topic, which you can find on our podcast blurb or on our Land and Climate Review website. If you can, please do try to leave us a review on whichever podcast platform you're using. as it will then make it easier for others to find us. Thanks to Vasko Kostovski for audio editing of the show, and Bertie will be back again in a few weeks' time with a fresh interview. Thanks a lot for listening.